promised, I am back with another lecture on the basics of Indian polity. Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Shobna Menon. Thank you so much for dropping by. I really appreciate it. Please go ahead and subscribe to my channel by pressing the subscribe button below. Now, in my previous lecture, we had discussed the features and drawbacks of the Regulating Act of 1773. In this lecture, we shall go back to the point where we left, which is the shortcomings of the Regulating Act, and we shall see how these drawbacks were rectified. I had discussed 5 drawbacks in my previous lecture. The first 3 drawbacks were regarding the relationship that the Governor General shared with the Supreme Court. And these 3 drawbacks were rectified in the Amending Act of 1781. Now, what were these 3 drawbacks? The first one was the overlapping of jurisdiction of powers between the Supreme Court and the Governor General. Especially when it came to deciding on issues relating to collection of revenue on the Diwani provinces, people were not sure whether to approach the Governor General or the Supreme Court. Even if a decision was taken, the other would often overrule the decision, and this further created a confusion on whose authority to obey, the Supreme Courts or the Governor Generals. The Amending Act of 1781 cleared this confusion and clearly stated that the jurisdiction of Governor General would prevail. So, any issues relating to collection of revenues would go to the Governor General. His judgments would preside. That is, the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over the collection of revenue. Okay. The second was the regulations that were passed by the Governor General and his council members had to be registered with the Supreme Court in order to become a law. Now, the problem was that the Supreme Court's Chief Justice would analyze the regulation, he would point out flaws, and he would not allow it to become a law. As a result, administration was delayed. Now, this particular procedure was completely eliminated from the Amending Act of 1781. So, it now said the Supreme Court does not need to interfere. Any regulation that was now made by the Governor General would become a law after the monarch in England signed it. So, all regulations would now directly go to London. The Supreme Court was completely removed out of the equation. The third drawback that I had discussed in my previous lecture was the treatment of Indians. Now, I had mentioned in my previous lecture that any law that was to be passed by the Supreme Court automatically assumed that it would apply to the natives as well. This ended up hurting the religious sentiments of Hindus and Muslims. After the passage of this Amending Act of 1781, it ensured that the Supreme Court would now follow the religious sentiments of Hindus as per the Hindu law and of the Muslims as per the Quran while applying the law. Right? So, these were the 3 drawbacks that were taking into consideration the relationship that the Governor General had with the Supreme Court, and they were resolved in the Amending Act of 1781. Not only this, the Governor General's judiciary powers increased. Now, if you notice, the Supreme Court's jurisdiction decreased while the Governor General was given more judicial powers in framing regulations for the provincial courts in the presidencies of Bombay and Madras. So, the Governor General's judicial powers were increased in the Amending Act of 1781. Okay, so you have to remember these features. Now, coming on to the second act following this was the Pitt's India Act of 1784. It was passed by William Pitts, who was the youngest Prime Minister of Britain at the age of 24. And he came out with certain regulations that were directed at improving the administration of the East India Company and gaining more control by the crown. Now, the other 2 drawbacks that I had mentioned in my previous lecture were the Governor General's relationship with his own council members and with the governors of Bombay and Madras. Now, what was the problem he was facing with his own council members, it seemed that the decisions were taken as per majority. So there were 4 council members and any majority decision would have to be taken in agreement with the council members as well. Now sometimes it happened that the Governor General was not in favor of the decision, but because it was a majority, he had to follow and he was accountable for such decisions. Now this created a lot of friction between the Governor General and the council members. With the Pitt's India Act of 1784, the strength of the council members was now reduced from 4 to 3. So now, for a decision to pass, the Governor General found it easier. He just needed support of 1 council members for the decision to become a regulation. So he could find it in him to face the council members and get his authority started, implemented. The other drawback was the relationship that the Governor General had with the governors of Bombay and Madras. Now, if you remember, I had spoken to you that on paper, the Regulating Act of 1773 did mention that the governors of Bombay and Madras were subordinate to the Governor General. But in reality, they were insubordinate. They did not listen to his instructions and they would pass decisions of their presidencies without confirming with him. But after the passage of Pitt's India Act of 1784, they made it impossible for the governors of Bombay and Madras to act without the assent of the Governor General. And they were clearly instructed to obey the Governor General, failing which they would suffer consequences. Okay, so these were the drawbacks that were dealt with. Okay, the new features that were introduced in the Pitt's India Act of 1784 was a completely new body. Now, if you are aware, the East India Company was actually managed by a court of directors. There were 24 court of directors who were elected by a court of proprietors. It was a larger body. Now, the court of directors had a jurisdiction over civil, revenue, military, commercial, trading activities, and all the governors would report to the court of directors. They would be appointed by the court of directors. But with the Pitt's India Act of 1784, a new body was formed. This body was called the Board of Control, and this new body now took over the jurisdiction of civil, revenue and military. The main functions that the Court of Directors practiced was now taken over by the Board of Control. Any decisions that were made regarding these matters were binding on the Court of Directors. They could not be against these decisions. Now, what was the composition of the Board of Control? The Board of Control had one Secretary of State. The Secretary of State was the President of the Board of Control. He would preside over the meetings of the Board of Control. Followed by the Secretary of State, we had the Chancellor of Exchequer. After which we had 4 Privy Councillors. The Privy Councillors were the closest advisors of the King. They were nominated by the King during his pleasure. So, in all, there were 6 members in the Board of Control, which was presided over by the Secretary of State. In his absence, the Chancellor of Exchequer would take over, or the senior most commissioner after him. So this was the composition of the Board of Control, very powerful. Now, the Court of Directors only retained the commercial function. Anything related to commerce and trade was to be engaged and practiced by the Court of Directors. They also had the power of patronage. Power of patronage means the right to appoint officials. However, the Governor General, the governors of Bombay and Madras, and the Commander-in-Chiefs, these designations can only and only be appointed by the Board of Control. So, the Court of Directors had no power that they earlier enjoyed over the Governor General and the other governors of Bombay and Madras. Now, another thing was that the Court of Proprietors had a lot of power in the decision making. of the East India Company. Now, any modification that they wanted had to be first appear with the permission of the Board of Control. So, any modification that they suggested first had to be approved by the Board of Control. So, basically, the Board of Control literally took over the entire operations of the company, and the Court of Directors was reduced to a very nominal body. So, these were the functions of the East India Company. These were the new changes that had taken place in the administration of the East India Company, which actually continued till 1858, the year after the Indian Rebellion, the Sepoy Mutiny, the revolt of 1857. Now, there were a few changes that had taken place in between, and those changes I shall discuss in the next lecture. Thank you so much for watching. If you have liked this video, please like, share, subscribe and comment. Have a good day.